The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear listeners and viewers, Assalamu alaikum. It's been a while, so I do apologize. I know I did, and Mr. Qazi did start off with the aspects within housing law. Now, we did reach homelessness sometime in the end of November, and there was one segment to that left for us to complete the housing segment of our shows and touch upon something else. So firstly, I do apologize. We couldn't obviously attend in December due to the seasonal holidays and the breaks that were pre-arranged by both of us. And last month, unfortunately, we couldn't attend because, just to give you a lowdown, I had a son who was not well, so just pray Allah gives him shifa, inshallah. So that being said, our sincere apologies for not attending, and we're going to be finishing off the segment of homelessness. Now, we went through a fair part by describing what is homelessness, giving the definition of homelessness in law, going through the Homelessness Act itself, going through various articles of the human rights and all sorts, and we were talking about a duty of care, etc. However, now today is the last part and the only aspect that is left in order for us to conclude homelessness, which is intentionally homelessness. Now, there are guidances in place to determine whether an individual has become intentionally homeless under the legislation that is put into place. Again, like we stated in the previous shows and this show as well, that the local borough or wherever the individual is residing in, as long as he meets the criteria, i.e. he's been living in the borough for over 6 years, etc., the borough will owe them a duty of care and a duty to house them. Now, going into that, I'll introduce my guest, also from the same firm as myself, .com Solicitors. I'd like to introduce Mr. Anwar Qazi, a solicitor of the firm. Assalamu alaikum, Anwar.
Assalamu alaikum to you, and assalamu alaikum, listeners. First, congratulations on issue of your son, and we wish him all the best ahead, actually. In regards to housing, housing is an extensive area of law, and if we allocate let's say another 12 to 13 shows, we still might not be able to conclude it. It's an extensive area of law. And having said that, on previous shows we discussed the types of tenancy agreement, and then we went on type of eviction, unlawful eviction, and then we went on about discussed about housing disrepair, and then we had a discussion on homelessness.
Right.
We can advise our listeners that they can follow those shows on Facebook page of Inspire FM, and
they're also on podcasts.
Those were general information that we provided, that we intended to provide to our listeners, and if they still require assistance on any aspects of housing matter, they can contact us through Inspire FM.
Yep.
And going ahead, actually, today I see, based on number of clients or number of people contacted us or instructed us or sought advice, I decided
because after the radio show, just to put it out there, we have been receiving messages on our social media accounts from people that tune in, and somehow they found us. But one of the queries that we did receive to our firm's Facebook page was, can you please go through intentional homeless? And again, is partly our fault, my fault for not mentioning this in the last show, that we will cover intentionally homelessness. I don't think I did. Now, that person specifically said, can you tell your solicitors to go over intentionally homeless? So again, to that person, if they're listening, we're going through intentionally homeless. Sorry for the delay once again. So jumping right into it, Mr. Qazi, what is the definition of intentionally homeless?
You see that the intentionally homeless will be considered by housing authorities as part of each application.
Right.
So any applicant who makes an application for homelessness, the local authorities or the housing authorities will consider this element.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the definition? So today we are going to talk about guidance, how housing authorities or how local authorities determine whether an applicant has become homeless intentionally.
Right.
Under Homelessness Act.
Yes.
And the main act that discusses, or the main section that discusses this the intentionally homelessness is Section 191 of the Housing Act 1996.
Right.
So before I go even into definition, actually, the prevention and relief duties owed to applicants who are eligible for assistance in homeless or threatened with homelessness apply, irrespective of whether or not they may be considered homeless intentionally.
Right.
So in general terms, if you have become homeless as a result of your own omission or failure, you might be considered as an intentionally homeless.
When would that kind of come into play? If a person, for example, doesn't pay their rent and accumulates rent arrears and gets evicted due to that, is it that kind of a scenario?
So they're different, and I'll go into detail into that. So if an applicant or if applicants deliberately fail to do anything, in consequence of which they cease to occupy accommodation, let's say rent arrears, and that the accommodation is available for their occupation, and it would have been reasonable for them to continue to occupy that property, but because of their own omission,
right,
they were compelled to leave or being evicted from that property. And it's not just rent arrears, a lot of other elements. Nuisance, breach of the terms of the tenancy.
Yeah.
So there are different scenarios, and in general terms, I'll put any omission that you lose your right or you breach your tenancy agreement.
Okay. But can there ever be a case where an individual themselves is in priority need or is a priority applicant, but the authorities still deem to be intentionally homeless?
You see, for the purpose of we discuss about act and omission. So, if any acts or omissions are made in good faith by someone who was not aware of any relevant fact, must not be considered as an intentionally homeless.
Okay.
What this relevant section or part of the housing refers to, especially families.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a partner is a joint tenant fails to pay the rent or breaches other terms of the tenancy, and the other partner is not aware, so you cannot find the second partner as homeless intentionally, so she will not be deemed as intentionally homeless because that is not his or her fault.
Yes, completely understood.
And sorry, I forgot your question about priority. Yes, you might be. That's quite common. This is not. You might be in priority need.
Okay.
And you may have been provided an interim accommodation while your application is fully considered, or you are found to be in priority need. But if you are found intentionally homeless, you will lose your priority need, or the duties will cease, and you may even lose your interim accommodation.
Okay, so just in a nutshell, what Mr. Qazi has just mentioned to us is that obviously he went through the guidance of intentional homelessness under the Housing Act. Now, in a synopsis, and just to sum up, Mr. Qazi has basically said that where a person is found intentionally homeless, it's mostly by their own omissions, i.e. they failed to pay their rent, they've breached the terms and conditions of the tenancy agreement, they've caused a nuisance, or they've done something along the sort to jeopardize their own tenancy. They would be considered intentionally homeless, which Mr. Qazi obviously elaborated in much more detail than what I've just said to you. And then obviously Mr. Qazi also said that there are circumstances where a housing authority might find an eligible applicant that who has a priority need but is homeless intentionally, and they may relieve their duty at times, or at other times, even though you're considered intentionally homeless, however, due to your personal circumstances at that time and your unawareness of the situation, the council might give you some merits and disregard the intentional homelessness and just put you under a homelessness criteria. Now, moving swiftly forward, Mr. Qazi, would you mind going over the definition or telling us and explaining to us the definition of intentional homelessness?
You see, in practical, we have had clients, so many clients. So we had people contacted us whereby they have received Section 8 notices.
Yeah.
And we discuss about Section 8. Section 8 notices either for rent arrear, there are 19 grounds, so fault-based notice. And most of these clients who lose their property for rent arrears or for other breaches of the tenancy under Section 8 or under those 19 grounds or Schedule
mandatory
2
grounds,
Schedule 2 of the Housing Act, then in those circumstances you have deliberately failed to take appropriate action, or you have failed to
coincide.
Take steps to remedy or to provide remedies to those breaches.
Yeah.
And these local authorities do go into the background, especially when they do read these possession orders and they go into background, they obtain further information from landlords, the type of notices was served. So it's quite advisable to our listeners that you make sure that you try not to do any act which will result in you becoming homeless, and then the local authorities will not provide you any assistance.
That's mostly put.
I'm going to go a little bit further actually. You see, every applicant is entitled to individual consideration of their application. It's case by case basis. This includes applicants where another member of their family or household has made or is making a separate application. If one member of the family is found intentionally homeless and the second member or the other members are not, or it's not their fault, then they are entitled to make a separate application.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
So in short term, there are safeguards in place. There are wider definition and guidance.
Mr. Qazi. I understand, Mr. Qazi. Again, I'll repeat my question. I don't think it come across. Can you go through and explain to us the definition of intentional homelessness, please?
Definition of intentionally homelessness. If you fail, or by your omission, you lose your property or your accommodation, and it was your fault, or as a result of your failure to act, or as a result of your omission, and you are evicted from that property, then
you're intentionally
homeless.
So
rent arrears, nuisance, harassment. We can go on and on different grounds.
That's fine. So in a nutshell, the definition of intentionally homeless according to the law is that if you have lost your property or you've been made homeless due to your own actions and your own contribution, in a nutshell.
That's right.
That's what we're saying. Now, I know that the Act goes into much further clarity than that, and it tells you a person who's intentionally homeless is breaking down into certain parts within the Act. Now, would you mind going over that for me, please?
Yeah, you see, there are technicalities,
Right.
always in legal terms we do have technicalities, and we have
Of
to
course.
local authorities will look into why that definition, and as I said before, it's case by case,
Merit by merit.
merits by case by case basis, and where applicants were not directly responsible for the act or omission which led to their family or household becoming homeless.
Yeah.
And then they may be treated as becoming homeless, like not intentionally. So if it's not your fault or not your omission, but it's another family member, these are technicalities, and that requires quite detailed discussion, which we are not going to go on this show.
That's fine. Now, obviously, we've gone over the definition, and you've briefly touched on the different segments, but saying it's too long to go into detail today. And we've also talked about the conduct which can result in being intentionally homeless, such as we said, the 19 grounds according to the mandatory, and the 19 mandatory grounds that are mentioned in order for somebody to issue a Section 8 notice and everything. Now, there's something called a cessation of occupation.
You see,
would you mind touching upon that briefly?
In legislations, you see, there's the definition of words are
crucial, yes,
crucial, and mostly decided by cases or case law by judges.
Yeah.
And then we have different rules of interpretation.
Yes.
So for intentional homeless to be established, there must have been an actual occupation of accommodation which has ceased. You're occupying the property, you were there, and you
ceased to
occupy because of your omission. So that's one of the elements that need to be proved in order for you to be found intentionally homeless.
So obviously you're saying that one of the things that could seize the occupation is that there was actual accommodation of the accommodation, sorry, I beg your pardon, which has now ceased for whatever reason, but due to the applicant's own, or the person or the individual's own contribution or actions or negligence, we could say, to somewhat regard. Does the occupation need to be continuous?
Yeah, that's another issue that has been discussed. Occupation does not necessarily involve continuous occupation at all times, provided that the occupation was at the disposal of the applicant and available for their occupation. So in simple terms, if you have a tenancy, either written or verbal, and you had a property where you had control of it, then even if you stay for continuous period of time, still it can be considered as occupation.
What if, I know, I'm just going back to one show now, when we were talking about eviction notices, and our lovely listener, he tuned in and he gave us a call, and he was speaking to me in Urdu, if you remember, and he was talking about his property in Pakistan, and he wants to evict his tenants, and he wanted me and you to send a Section 21 from here. Now, just for the safe side, I mean, what if the person's been made homeless overseas? Does that make sense? He's become intentionally homeless outside of the United Kingdom.
You see, one of the interesting...
Because that is, I mean, that will be in some people's mind, because, I mean, working in the wider community, we always see, I mean, I know it might be a bit absurd to some people, but we always see this where we get clients coming into our offices even, and they've come from somewhere in Nigeria or, certain parts of Asia or a less economically developed country or region. And they always say, listen, we were homeless there, and shall we put this in our application? So does it apply to people living, does it apply to properties that are lost outside of the UK?
Yeah, you see, about your friend, you discuss, as solicitors, no, we cannot just do whatever we want. If you want to act for somebody, we have to go through certain procedures.
Yes, indeed.
We have to have files in place. Any letter we send, we need to keep it for 6 years in our firm. We have to do a lot of
Yes, Mr. Qazi.
So absolutely, it's a kind of wrong perception. Most people think we're solicitors and we can write letters and just send out. No, that's not the case.
Yes, Mr. Qazi.
We have duties and obligations. That's the first point. Another thing that as part of this application, all those applicants who make application for homelessness, one of the questions they're normally asked: do you have any properties abroad?
Okay. Yes.
You see, so you cannot exclude those properties. So the accommodation which has been lost can be outside of the UK.
So that will still apply.
That will still apply. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the person that rang in the eviction show, this part of the law will apply to him as well.
It's
Yeah.
unfortunate, and we have seen cases.
Okay, that's fine. And I know you keep mentioning, we'll mention this, and I think it'll just be in time for a break then. You keep mentioning the deliberate act or the omission of the applicant or the individual themselves. Now, for intentional homelessness, does the ending of the occupation of the accommodation have to be a consequence of the deliberate act or omission by the applicant?
You see, before I answer that question, actually, there's another thing that you see. Most clients or most people approach us where they've been offered a property and they think it's not suitable, and they ask you one question: what if I refuse the offer?
Yeah.
You see, that's one of the areas of housing that we have been contacted. So, but then there are guidance, and housing authorities are reminded that applicants cannot be considered to have become homeless intentionally because of failing to take up an offer of accommodation.
Yep.
It says accommodation.
Right.
But then it says, but an applicant whose refusal of a suitable accommodation or suitable offer of accommodation brought an end to an end, and then in these circumstances, these type of applicants are more likely than not that they will be found intentionally homeless.
Right. Okay, Mr. Qazi, now let's talk about the question. Can you answer the question?
Please? That's right. Consequences of deliberate act or omission we discussed generally just at the beginning of this show. For homeless to be intentional, the ending of occupation of the accommodation must be a consequence of a deliberate act or omission by the applicant.
Okay.
And then deliberate, you see, we will discuss about deliberate later on. And omission, you see, failure to pay rent, causing nuisance.
So a deliberate omission would be something like the 19 grounds we previously covered.
Right. Likely. Yeah,
something
exactly.
like nuisance, causing nuisance within the accommodation, the rental arrears, defects in the property caused by the applicant themselves, etc., etc. That could equate to being a deliberate omission.
And it's not limited to Schedule 2 of the Housing Act or those 19
mandatory grounds. Yes,
it's not limited. There are other grounds that you might be found intentionally homeless. And having established that there was a deliberate act or omission, then the housing authority will need to decide whether the loss of the applicant's home is the reasonably likely result of that act or omission. Is there a connection between that omission and loss of the property.
Okay, which will then obviously cause an effect due to the
That's
consequences.
right. Yeah. So this is quite wider definition. It's not that the councils will, the local authorities will will narrowly decide on your application, and this is a matter of cause and effect, basically, or we say causation.
Yes, indeed.
We have this phrase or this word in
No.
personal injury, more or
Just generally in law.
generally, yeah, those things. So it's a matter of causation. An example would be where a person voluntarily gave up settled accommodation that would have been reasonable for them to continue to occupy.
Okay,
And move
Mr.
into-
Qazi, I'm going to have to stop you there. We're going to be off for a break. Stay tuned. And you're listening to Inspire FM. It's the Ask Your Lawyer show. I'm your host, Mujib of .com Solicitors. And I'm joined by my guest, Mr. Qazi, also of .com Solicitors.
You're listening to an Inspire FM podcast, making available our popular programs from our daily broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Ask Your Lawyer show on Inspire FM 105.1 FM. And I'm your host, Mujib Rahman of .com Solicitors, and I'm joined by my guest, Mr. Anwar Qazi, also of .com Solicitors. Any questions that you have, you could call us on 01582 481 822. Similarly, you could text your questions to through WhatsApp to 07779 481 822. Now we're talking about intentional homelessness. Sorry, we've got quite a way through the segment, so those of you that missed the show, you could go back to the podcast and look through, as we've got a lot to go through. Now we've reached Mr. Qazi. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. And we've reached to quite a fair amount. Now, how can somebody cease to be intentionally homeless was the next part we were going to start. So would you like going through that, please?
That's right, yeah. So you cannot, so in a simple word and simple phrase, you cannot remain intentionally homeless, let's say, for the rest of your life. Yeah. So there should be some events or events that you will no longer be deemed as intentionally homeless, and the guidance or the law on this matter says that where a person becomes homeless intentionally, that condition may continue until the link between the casual act or omission and the intervening event, which, irrespective of any act or omission on the part of the applicant, would have itself led to their being homeless at that point, or at which the housing authority was carrying out inquiries into their application for assistance. Or this might be the case where, or let me give an example actually that will make it simple. This might be the case where, for example, an applicant gave up accommodation without sufficient good reason, but at later point at which they applied for assistance due to homelessness, this accommodation will no longer have been available for them. Or let's give another example. If you're found intentionally homeless and you move on and you rented that accommodation in private sector, so now if you are served with a notice to leave that property, then you cannot be deemed as intentionally homeless in your future application. So there should be a break of chain of events.
Okay. So in a nutshell, you can't always be intentionally homeless. There will come a stage where you will no longer be, sorry about that, I've just got my mic so far. There will be a stage where you're not considered intentionally homeless, but however, there are certain conditions that need to continue, shall I say, until the link between the casual act or omission and the intentional homelessness has actually been broken, i.e. the person has to meet certain conditions or do certain things in order to establish certain conditions in order for the homelessness aspect to deteriorate. Is that?
That's right. The causal link between a deliberate act or omission and intentionally homeless or intentional homeless is more typically broken by a period in settled accommodation which follows the intentional homelessness. Whether that accommodation is settled will depend on the circumstances of the case.
Of the case or the individual.
With factors such as security of tenure, length of residence being relevant. There are other elements. Or in short term, there should be a break of chain of events.
Yes. Understand. Now, we did talk about the deliberate act or omission prior to the break, and you were saying we're going to go into detail just after the break. So just recapping on that, would you mind going through a bit more detail?
That's right. One element of intentionally homeless is deliberate act or omission. And for homelessness to be intentional, the act or omission that led to the loss of accommodation must have been deliberate.
Yep.
And the applicants must always been given the opportunity to explain such behavior.
Yeah.
Or an act or omission should not generally be treated as deliberate. There are circumstances or circumstances where there have been omissions.
Yes.
Has not been deliberate.
Yes, I understand.
And I give an example in family members. Imagine, a family member is deliberately failing to fulfill his obligation and his or her obligation under tenancy, where the partner is absolutely not aware of what's going on.
Yes, I understand.
So that's one of the issue, and even where deliberately or an omission or an act was deliberately done or carried out, if it's forced upon the applicant through no fault of their own.
Yes.
Or an act or omission made in good faith, where someone genuinely, ignorant of relevant fact must not be treated as deliberate. So there are case laws on these points, whether your act was deliberate or not.
Okay, so just in a general rule of thumb, an act or omission should not be considered deliberate, where, for example, the act or omission was for non-payment of rent or mortgage costs which arose from the person's personal circumstances, i.e. financial difficulties, which were beyond the applicant's control themselves, or were the result of housing benefits or some kind of benefits issues with the DWP had occurred due to the delays in processing the applications, which we see time and time after again. But again, as housing solicitors, we know that some judges are very open to that and they're very accepting of that, and they understand that, look, it's not the applicant's own fault, it's due to the delays that the DWP currently holds or the backlogs that they're going through. And also basically the housing authority has some kind of a reason to believe that the applicant is unable to manage their own affairs. For example, they have some kind of mental health issues or mental health disabilities, whereby, for example, they're mentally not capable enough of conducting such activities for themselves. And or again, the act or omission is a result of having a limited mental capacity, as we just mentioned, and or the act or the omission was made by the applicant under duress or through some kind of force or anything, or the person had a lack of foresight on the part of an application led to homelessness, but the act or omission was actually in what the applicant thought was good faith, but in actual essence it wasn't. Now, when, again, just to go a bit further, if you could elaborate on when the applicant's actions will not amount to intentional homelessness.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so as you repeated, there are circumstances
Mhm.
where your act or omission was not deliberate, and we have so many people as a result of delay in processing the benefit application. I'll not say just housing benefit, because we now have universal credit in place. Some people have lost their properties, or some people have faced financial
Financial
hardship
difficulties,
beyond their
Personal
control. You see,
yeah.
these are the circumstances where they will not be found
Intentionally.
intentionally homeless, and
Right.
applicants' action would not amount to intentional intentionally homeless, where they have lost their home or were compelled to sell it
Right.
because of rent or mortgage arrears, resulting from significant financial difficulties, and the applicant was genuinely unable to keep up the rent or mortgage payments,
Yes.
even after claiming housing benefits,
Mhm.
and no further financial help
Gosh,
was available at the time. This part refers to where people lose their jobs suddenly.
Yeah.
Or imagine your housing benefit is not covering your entire rent, and you don't have any other means to keep up with your mortgage or with your rent. So in these kind of circumstances, you cannot be, these acts or these omission cannot amount to intentional homelessness. And there are other situations where an applicant has lost a former home due to rent arrears. The reasons why the arrears incurred or should be fully explored. You see, one of the element, or the local authorities will investigate mainly on when it comes to rent arrears or mortgage arrears, is what happened,
Mm-hmm.
what the reasons that you came to this situation.
Yes.
So if there are circumstances or situation where it was beyond your control,
Yes.
then you cannot be considered as intentionally homeless. And if the decision is, if the local authorities still find you intentionally homeless, these can be challenged.
All right.
And having said that, we did provide information or guidance to our clients that whenever the local authorities make decisions on your applications or on an applicant, you do have the right to request for a review, where you can put forward all your reasons if you're found intentionally homeless. And you can go further to appeal it on point of law, so we don't want to go to those stages. Yeah.
No problem. That's fine. Moving swiftly forward, because time's elapsing and I really want this finished off today. Is there examples of acts or omissions which may be regarded as deliberate? I know we went through a few, but
that's right. And as I said, you see, it's not limited to those 19 grounds. There are other grounds that
okay.
that you can be deemed as intentionally homeless. Let's say, loss of home because of persistent refusal to pay rent or mortgage payments. An example is a clear example, provided that it was not because of your financial difficulties that was beyond your control. Further could be said to have significantly neglected their affairs, having disregarded sound advice from professionals, qualified people, nuisance, surrendering tenancy agreements without any reason, without any good reasons. Or evicted because of anti-social behavior.
ASBOs,
ASBOs, nuisance, harassments to neighbors. Or there are further, we can say violence or threat of violence. That's
basically conducting yourself in an unreasonable manner.
That's right. So any act which is
amounts to that.
unreasonable, and you do not have or you do not have reasonable explanation, will amount to deliberate act, and you will be found intentionally.
Okay, that's fine. And Mr. Qazi, you also spoke about something, and you said when an act or omission is in good faith. Would you care to elaborate on that, just for the listeners?
Acts or omission made by the applicant in good faith, where they were genuinely unaware of a relevant fact, must not be regarded as deliberate. And I give an example, and it refers to mostly to these joint tenants or family members or partners. A family member fails to keep up with rents or continuously causing nuisance or harassment or other acts, where the other partner is not aware of all these acts. So that second partner cannot be cannot be found intentionally homeless, because
He was under duress.
under duress, or was not aware of the whole the circumstances. So it was not her or his fault.
Okay. What if the applicant enters into an arrangement or agreement of some sort? What will they have to do?
Housing authorities will need to be alert to the possibility of collusion, by which a person may claim that they are obliged to leave available accommodation that would have been reasonable for them to continue to occupy, in order to take advantage of the homeless legislation. This talking about, you see, we had practical cases where people were living with their family members, and although they were not told by their parents to leave the property, but in order to take advantage, in order to secure a permanent accommodation, they have approached the council for assistance. You see, so therefore there is a guidance to local authorities or to housing authorities to carefully consider and comply with these determinations. But having said that, we should really understand that there's shortage of property, shortage of houses. Councils, local authorities have stated on many occasions. Yeah, exactly. So priority is given to those who are in desperate need,
who have certain merits and criteria that they fulfill.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. That's fine, Mr. Qazi. So they will have to notify the council for any kind of arrangement that they've agreed to or colluded to, some sort. And you gave an example whereby there was a client, he was living with the family, it was a bit overcrowded for him. He didn't get kicked out, but he needed his own secure tenancy in order for himself and his family. And he approached the council who assisted him.
The word collusion is not confined to arrangements with friends or relatives. You see, we have genuine cases where people have lived with their parents or with relatives for a number of years, but because of some kind of disputes, they're compelled to leave. So we cannot say definitively yes, there are some cases. It's collusion is also can occur between landlords and tenants. When we have seen cases like that. So that's why there is guidance, or there are guidance that local authorities should closely monitor these type of situation to make sure the system is not abused.
That's fine, Mr. Qazi. Again, assalamu alaikum to the listeners and viewers that have just tuned in. Welcome to the Ask Your Lawyer show on Inspire FM 105.1 FM. Any questions, feel free to call us on 01582 481 822. Alternatively, you could WhatsApp us on 07779 481 822. If you've got any questions at any point, we're available. We're still here for the next 7-8 minutes. And if for some absurd reason we're not around, please leave your questions with the staff at Inspire FM, and by all means they will get back to us. And there you have it. Today we went all over, we finished off with intentional homelessness. Now, Mr. Qazi, again, just to go through some kind of a recap with you, we discussed the guidance on determining whether the applicant has or is intentionally homeless under the homelessness legislation. And as we mentioned in our previous homelessness segments, we talked about the duty of care and duty to rehouse anyway, but we stated that local authorities owe duty to the constituencies. And now you said there's certain guidance that needs to be determined on an applicant in order to establish whether they're intentionally homeless or not. And you did mention the act that it came under. Now we went through the guidances. We were talking about the prevention of the relief duty owed to the applicants who are eligible for assistance and homelessness or threatened with homelessness, applicants who have priority need. You also touched upon, sometimes it'll be a situation where the local authority finds an eligible applicant who has priority needs but is intentionally homeless, and they relieve their duty. At other times, they'll find somebody who is intentionally homeless. However, due to them being unaware of the situation or the circumstances or how their homelessness arose, the council will kind of waiver that intentional part out of the homelessness and just keep them to homelessness and allow the homelessness application to be met, which we've already spoken about on previous segments. And you spoke and you gave us a little synopsis of the definition of intentional homelessness according to the Housing Act. And you, in a nutshell, said intentionally homeless is when an applicant, by their own omissions or their own actions, deliberately is made homeless. That, in a nutshell, is intentionally homeless. And he gave examples of where there might be a nuisance, they might not pay their rent, and the landlord was left with, or the association was left with no choice but to serve them with an eviction. So due to that, they didn't have any accommodation. And you spoke about the conduct which can result in intentional homelessness, and we spoke about the deliberate act and omission, and you went over it briefly. And you elaborated on it after the break, after our first break as well. And you said, look, the applicant has to be has to breach something in the terms and conditions of the tenancy, i.e., not comply with their tenant terms and conditions. They could damage the property, cause a nuisance, rental arrears, and you said it's much more wider than that as well. And we did go over that, and we were talking about whether the occupation can cease. And you said, look, for there to be intentionally homeless, the occupation has to be seized, and it could even be outside the UK, because in the homelessness application, you said they'll always question you about whether you've got properties outside the UK or you've ever had a property outside the UK and what's actually happened. We're talking about the consequences of the term that we use, the deliberate acts or omission. And you said the homelessness to be intentional, the ending of occupation of the accommodation has to be a consequence of a deliberate act or omission by the applicant. And we gave examples, i.e. not paying your mortgage, rent, etc. That's deliberate. And we were talking about, can a person ever cease to be intentionally homeless? And you said yes, you can. However, they have to break that link between the casual acts or omission and the intentional homelessness itself, and they have to break what you call the causation. We went on to talk about the deliberate act, and again we went over it again, and you explained in much more detail here that it could generally be for non-payment or stuff like that. And you did say that there are circumstances where an applicant might have done the act, but he won't be regarded as intentionally homeless, i.e. their age, their mental capacity, the personal circumstances at the time, as long as they could put forward a proportionate and reasonable explanation as to why that situation occurred with them, i.e. they've lost a job, they couldn't pay rent, they had no money, or the benefits were coming, they applied for benefits which were being delayed and backlogged by the DWP, etc. And we went through all that as well. And we went you explained all that to us, and you also went through the act or omission of in good faith, because we did mention that. And you said, look, it could be where a person was in a situation, they gave up possession of accommodation in the belief that they had no legal rights. So they've done it out of good faith, thinking I've got no legal standing, but in actual fact they did.
Different grounds,
Yeah.
absolutely different
But
grounds.
obviously you went through much more grounds than that, and we were also talking about what happens if an applicant enters into an agreement and you said, look, they have to make the housing authority alert of the possibility of collusion, by which you also gave an example of a client of yours saying, look, he was living with his family and, you know, you've seen it time after time again. However, he needed his own space. There's not much space for him. He went over to his local council and applied for housing, and they decided to house him. Now, that's just a brief summary of what we discussed today.
That's
and
right,
what you've
Majid.
explained, Mr. Qazi. Would you like to add anything to that?
It's quite advisable to our listeners, you know, in particular those who have secure tenancy. See, we have met people or clients who had secure tenancy, and because of their omission or deliberate act, they have lost their secure tenancy. So it's very advisable for these clients or these people to make sure that you keep your rent up to date, and you make sure you do not act or deliberately in such a manner where you lose your right. It will be so difficult, almost I would say impossible for you to secure another tenancy agreement, and it's not limited to rent arrears, all other things.
It's much more vast than that. Anyway, Mr. Qazi, thank you for your time today, and dear viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in. I'm your host Mujib Rahman from Asila Show. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We stream our daily broadcast on inspirefm.org. You'll find all our daily updates on our social media at Inspire FM Luton.